Take a modern German DNA test, and it won't show one bloodline. It'll show three completely different ancient populations arriving thousands of years apart, none of whom would have recognized the nation their DNA eventually built. The first were dark-skinned hunter-gatherers with startling blue eyes, walking these forests thousands of years before Germany existed. The second arrived from Anatolia, bringing farming and lighter skin. The third came last, steppe migrants from thousands of miles east, carrying alleles associated with blonde hair and a Y chromosome marker still carried by roughly 40 to 50% of German men today, depending on region. Historians argued about which group really became the Germans for 200 years. Ancient DNA just answered it, not one bloodline, but a collision of three. Here's how three unrelated ancient populations, thousands of years and thousands of miles apart, ended up as one modern nation's genome. Germany today is home to about 84 million people, sitting at the center of Europe, bordered by 9 countries and drained by the Rhine, the Elbe, and the Danube. That position is not incidental. For thousands of years, it sat directly across every major migration route the continent has ever produced, east to west, north to south. That's the reason German DNA is so layered in the first place. About 75% of the population identifies as ethnically German, but inside that number is enormous regional variation. A Bavarian from the Alps and someone from Hamburg on the North Sea coast share a language and, in most cases, a passport. Genetically, they don't share the same story. Their ancestry echoes different prehistoric populations, different medieval settlement patterns, centuries of regional isolation that never fully dissolved. Germany is also home to one of the largest Turkish communities outside Turkey, along with significant Polish, Russian, Italian, and more recent Syrian and Afghan populations. Modern Germany is quite visibly a mosaic. What's less visible is that the native German genetic profile, the one people assume is a single ancient bloodline, is itself a mosaic. It's just an older one. 3 ancient populations arriving over thousands of years, each left a permanent signature. To understand what's actually sitting in German DNA, you have to go back to the first of those 3. It starts before Germany, before Europe, as most people picture it, even existed. Before going further, one thing needs correcting. For most of history, being German had nothing to do with bloodline. It came down to language. German belongs to the Germanic branch of the Indo-European language family, the same family that includes English, Dutch, Swedish, and Danish. That already tells you something important. The ancestors of the Germans were never confined to what is now Germany. They spread across a huge stretch of northern and western Europe. Proto-Germanic, the common ancestor of all those languages, was likely spoken in southern Scandinavia and the northern coastal plains of what is now Denmark and northern Germany roughly 2,500 years ago. And that language itself descended from an older Indo-European language that arrived in Central Europe with migrations out of the Pontic steppe, the grasslands north of the Black Sea, around 4,500 to 5,000 years ago. So when Roman writers described the Germanic peoples as tall, fair, and forest-dwelling, they were describing the product of thousands of years of population mixing, not a bloodline that had always existed in one place. As Germanic tribes moved into Britain, into France, into southern Europe, the language traveled with them. It did not erase the people already living there. It got absorbed. Germanic identity was always more linguistic than biological. So if German was never one bloodline to begin with, what were the actual ancient populations underneath it? That's where the 3 bloodlines come in. The first bloodline arrived long before agriculture, long before any language we'd recognize. Ancient DNA studies have shown that the hunter-gatherers who lived in what's now Germany roughly 8,000 to 10,000 years ago looked nothing like the modern stereotype. They were dark-skinned, and many of them had blue eyes. That combination sounds strange today, but it was common across Mesolithic Europe. The genes for light skin simply hadn't spread through the population yet. That came later with two migrations that hadn't happened yet. Blue eyes, on the other hand, trace back to a single ancient mutation, one of the oldest single origin traits geneticists have identified anywhere in the human genome. Its exact geographic starting point is still debated among researchers. What's well established is that it's one mutation, extremely old, and it spread through European hunter-gatherer populations well before farming ever arrived on the continent. These hunter-gatherers had no farming, no metal tools, and no fixed settlements yet. Central and Northern Europe had only recently emerged from the last ice age, and the terrain they moved through was dense forest cut through by river systems, the same network that still defines Germany's geography today. They lived in small, mobile bands, following seasonal game and foraging routes, likely numbering in the low thousands across the entire region, rather than anything resembling a settled population. For several thousand years, they were the only people in this part of Europe, and their genetic signature had the region entirely to itself. Then their numbers started getting diluted, not erased, but folded into two much larger population waves that arrived one after another. This first bloodline never vanished from Germany. It's still measurably present in modern German DNA today, just no longer the dominant signal. It's the base layer everything else was built on top of, and every population that followed inherited a piece of it through mixing rather than replacement. What makes this first population genuinely surprising isn't just the dark skin and blue eyes on their own, it's how completely that combination contradicts the popular image of what an ancient Northern European should have looked like. The classic fair-skinned, light-eyed look that gets projected backward onto every early population in this region simply didn't exist yet. It was assembled later, piece by piece, gene by gene, by the two bloodlines that arrived after this one. That's the first population. If you've ever taken a DNA test and found an ancestry group you didn't expect, drop it in the comments, because that's exactly the kind of surprise this whole story is built on. And if you're into this kind of history, subscribe now, because the next bloodline is the one that actually explains where the German look comes from. The next one came from over 1,000 miles away, and it changed almost everything about how people in this region actually lived. The second bloodline arrived by a completely different route, and it changed how people in this region lived, not just how they looked. Around 7,500 years ago, farmers began arriving from Anatolia, the region that's now Turkey, bringing agriculture up through the Danube river corridor into Central Europe. This was no small trickle of people, but a population wave large enough to substantially reshape the genetic makeup of everyone already living there, moving at a pace the existing hunter-gatherer population simply couldn't match. These farmers brought lighter skin genes with them, one of the two migrations responsible for the eventual Northern European appearance. The hunter-gatherers hadn't had it. This is the first of the two populations that introduced it into the region. They also brought an entirely new way of life, permanent settlements instead of seasonal camps, domesticated livestock, and stored grain that could feed a community through winter without following migrating herds. That kind of surplus lets a population grow faster and settle far more densely than mobile hunter-gatherer groups ever could, and it's a large part of why this second wave left such a substantial genetic footprint. The genetic impact of this migration wasn't uniform across what's now Germany. Southern Germany, closer to the Danube route these farmers actually traveled, carries a noticeably higher share of this Anatolian farmer ancestry than the north does. It's one of the clearest examples in this whole story of how a single ancient migration route, followed thousands of years ago, left a permanent, regional fingerprint that's still directly detectable in DNA today. This wave didn't replace the hunter-gatherers who came before it, at least not completely. The two populations mixed, unevenly, over many generations, region by region, valley by valley. But the farmer's genetic contribution was large enough that, by the time the third and final bloodline arrived, the population of Central Europe already looked genetically very different from the hunter-gatherers who'd occupied the same land only a few thousand years earlier. So by roughly 5,000 years ago, two ancestral populations were already layered into what would eventually become German DNA. Hunter-gatherers at the base, Anatolian farmers on top of them, concentrated more heavily in the south. Neither of these groups spoke anything resembling German. Neither would have recognized the nation that would eventually rise out of their mixing thousands of years later. Then the third population arrived, and it is the one that left the deepest and most recognizable mark of all three. Around 4,500 years ago, a new population began moving into Western and Central Europe. Archaeologists call this the Bell Beaker phenomenon, named for a distinctive bell-shaped drinking vessel found repeatedly in their burials. These were skilled metal workers and archers, and they came from the Eurasian steppe carrying enormous amounts of ancestry unlike anything already present in the region. A landmark 2018 study published in the journal Nature, led by Inigo Olalde at Harvard University and involving more than 100 ancient genomes, found that in Britain specifically, the Bell Beaker expansion replaced roughly 90% of the existing Neolithic population within just a few centuries, one of the most dramatic population turnovers ever documented in ancient DNA anywhere in the world. That number is specific to Britain. On the European continent, including what is now Germany, the picture is different, large-scale but partial. The steppe migrants mixed into an already layered population rather than wiping it out, adding a third genetic stream on top of the two that already existed. What they left behind was still enormous. This population carried the R1BY chromosome haplogroup, which roughly 40 to 50% of German men carry today, with the exact frequency shifting by region, higher in Western Germany, while Eastern Germany carries more of a related steppe-descended marker instead. They also carried genes associated with blonde hair, one of the most recognizable Germanic traits in the popular imagination. Geneticist David Reich has argued that this classic European blonde hair variant entered the continent largely through these same steppe migrations, and more recent large-scale genetic studies support the broader pattern. Blonde hair in modern Europeans tracks with farmer and steppe ancestry, not with the earlier hunter-gatherer population that came before either of them. And this same population very likely carried an early form of the Indo-European language that would eventually develop into Proto-Germanic itself, the same linguistic root covered earlier. So the population responsible for the classic Germanic look is also, most likely, connected to the linguistic root of German itself. That is not a coincidence historians simply missed for 2 centuries. It is a connection ancient DNA has only been able to confirm in the last several years, as sequencing techniques matured enough to extract reliable genome-wide data from bones this old. 3 separate ancient populations, arriving at 3 different times and from 3 different geographic directions, thousands of years and thousands of miles apart. And by the time this third wave had settled in and mixed with what came before it, the genetic foundation of what would eventually be called German was largely complete, long before anyone spoke German, and long before Germany existed as an idea at all. If you have German ancestry, or you're just as surprised as I was that the classic Germanic look is only a few thousand years old, hit subscribe. There's a lot more of this real genetic history coming. For most of the 20th century, historians and archaeologists split into 2 camps on this question, and they genuinely disagreed. One camp argued the Germanic peoples were indigenous to Central Europe, descendants of populations with deep, continuous roots in the region going back thousands of years without any single dramatic outside replacement. The other camp pointed to the archaeological record, especially the Bell Beaker transition, and argued that the people who became the Germans were primarily descendants of migrants who arrived from the steppe during the Bronze Age. Ancient DNA has since shown that both camps were partly right, and the real story is more layered than either side argued on its own. Modern Germans carry ancestry from all three populations covered so far: the original hunter-gatherers, the Anatolian farmers, and the Bronze Age steppe migrants. Proportions genuinely differ by region. Southern Germany carries more of the Anatolian farmer signature, tracing directly back to that Danube migration route. Northern Germany carries more of the hunter-gatherer and steppe signature, tied to the Bronze Age Nordic cultures of the North European plain. A Bavarian and someone from Schleswig-Holstein are, genetically, weighted noticeably differently toward these three ancestral groups, even though both would simply say they're German. On the paternal line specifically, two Y chromosome markers are especially prominent in Germany: R1BU106, the clearest steppe-descended Germanic marker, and I1, associated with Norse and Nordic Bronze Age populations, and more common in the north. But these two aren't the only lineages that matter. R1A, more associated with populations further east, is also significant, particularly in eastern Germany. No single haplogroup tells the whole story on its own, and reducing this to just two markers oversimplifies a genuinely three-part regional picture. So the honest answer to the century-old historians' debate lands in neither camp. Modern German DNA is the layered, regionally uneven result of all three ancient populations, mixed unevenly by geography over thousands of years. That reconciliation is recent. It's only been possible since ancient DNA sequencing matured over roughly the last decade and a half. No honest account of German genetic history can skip what happened in the 20th century, when a political ideology tried to weaponize ancestry. Between 1933 and 1945, the German state built an entire ideological system around the idea of a single superior ancestral bloodline, a mythologized version of purity that had never existed in any genetic reality. None of this was science. The regime dressed up invented mythology to look like biology and used it to justify catastrophic violence. The three bloodline picture covered in this video is, in a very direct sense, the rebuttal to that ideology. There was never one pure ancestral line running through German history. There were three separate ancient populations, arriving from three different directions over thousands of years, mixing unevenly by region: a hunter-gatherer population, a farming population from Anatolia, and a steppe population from thousands of miles east. None of them is more authentically German than the others. All three are equally the real story. Modern population genetics doesn't just fail to support the 20th century's racial mythology, it actively dismantles it, layer by layer, population by population. That's not a political statement, it's what the DNA itself shows. If you know someone who still believes the old mythology instead of the real science, share this with them. This is the actual rebuttal. So here's the honest, current answer to a question people have argued about for 200 years. Modern Germans descend from three ancient populations that converged in Central Europe over thousands of years. First, the original hunter-gatherers who occupied the region after the last ice age. Dark-skinned, blue-eyed, the base layer beneath everything else. Second, farmers who migrated in from Anatolia around 7,500 years ago, bringing agriculture and lighter skin, concentrated more heavily in the south. Third, steppe migrants who arrived around 4,500 years ago, bringing the R1b haplogroup, the genes for blonde hair, and very likely the linguistic root of German itself. None of these three populations spoke German. None of them would have recognized the nation their mixing eventually produced. And on top of this three-part foundation, later history added smaller, regionally specific layers. some Roman era admixture along the old frontier, some later Slavic and Norse influence, real but modest compared to the three founding populations covered here. Ancient DNA research in Germany is moving fast, with institutions like the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig publishing new findings regularly. This picture will keep getting sharper. If you found this useful, the like button genuinely helps this channel reach more people who are into this kind of history. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's the time, because there's a lot more of this real genetic history still to cover.